Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll wait just one more minute as folks continue to stream in here. All right, we're on the half hour, so let's get going. Hello and welcome, everyone. So common data is a powerful thing for grantees and funders alike. It can lead to reduced burdens for the grantees to give them the capacity to make an impact with the work they do. And I'm excited to be here with you and especially excited to facilitate this session, applying the nonprofit common data model with Dan Lamott from threshold.world. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Anthony Putignano, VP of Engineering here at Flux. I've been in the software as a service world for about 20 years now, and the grants management space for about 10 of those. I'm super excited and proud to be with Flux, helping advance all of your missions. Dan, why don't you share with everyone a bit about yourself and the exciting work that you're doing?
Cool, Anthony, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
You're good.
All right, just making sure I'm off the dreaded double mute, which I have a tendency of clicking a couple of times a day. But good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are, maybe good evening, if those some of you are on the other side of the pond. I'm Dan Lamott. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called threshold.world. And I've been working in the nonprofit technology space very happily and with a lot of passion for the better part of the last 15 years. It's a little difficult to actually get my head around that, but I spent about 9 years or so working in the kind of fundraising and grant management space, mostly on the Salesforce platform, but certainly integrating with a lot of other platforms. At that time, I was competing with Flux, believe it or not. And then for the last 4.5 years or so, I've been focused mostly on Microsoft-based solutions, but also really open data and common data models and developing common data languages. I'm based in Puerto Rico. I'm a bit of a surf bum at heart, and I'm really excited to get to learn from everybody and speak with you all today. So thank you to Anthony, to you, and the rest of the team at Flux for allowing me to come hang out with the crew today. Really appreciate it. So today, oh, yeah, go ahead. Great. Well, we talk a lot about storytelling over here at Threshold, and we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about that today. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a story and share a number with you that's kind of meaningful if you really think about it. If you back yourself up, maybe this will age a few of us, but if you put yourself right around the year 1800, the world was at that point kind of midway through the first industrial revolution. And that was very much in full swing in Britain of many other places. And mining for things like coal and metals in England and all around Europe, for that matter, was really at a fever pitch. And those materials were providing the fuel and raw materials for the progress that was being made to try to improve the state of the world and the lives and livelihoods of those who are lucky enough to call it home, like us. And it was a time of great movement of people and goods and materials, and all of that stuff was powering that industrial revolution. And to try to make that more efficient, these things called railroads sprung up all over Europe, the United States, and places like Russia. But there was a big problem. And the issue was that the different organizations, whether they were governments or companies, were creating these railroads, and they were competing with each other. Each of them were concerned about their market share more than they were about the progress of society and citizens around the world. And nowhere was that more obvious than the way that they were laying down these railroad tracks across their own territories. So instead of coming together and agreeing on a common way to build tracks, to move goods and services and people around borders, they each did it their own way. And they did that on purpose so that their competitors couldn't travel on their tracks. So in England, the tracks were 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart, which is exactly the number of millimeters you see on the screen here. Most of Western Europe was the same. United States and Canada had their own measures. And in particular, places like Spain and Portugal, who were very concerned with France meddling in their business at the time, had a different gauge of track, which was 5 feet, 6 inches. So if you were trying to move goods and services from Spain or Portugal across France and other parts of Europe, you had to stop, take everything off the train, put it on somebody else's train, pay the fees to make that happen, and then get it to move to the other stages, a lot like moving data between the systems that we work with today. So at the time, because of this kind of competitive difference amongst these different parties, the development of railroads and so forth really kind of took on lives of their own, depending on who was in charge. And there were no universal standards. And the outcome of that was that there was a lot of inefficiency. There was unnecessary competition. There was a lot of repetitive work. And ultimately, the progress of society and lives and livelihoods was slowed. And believe it or not, it took another 86 years for the majority of the railroads in the United States to agree on a standard gauge. So it just shows you how the issues that we deal with today in terms of data interoperability come from these legacy issues around a desire to compete with each other more than to try to collect around shared progress. There are other standards out there, which are ideas like the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Agenda that tries to unite our effort around progress. The global goals, so to speak, were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as a universal call to end, to unite action towards ending poverty and protecting the planet. And they are all integrated in recognition that the actions in one area affect the outcomes and actions in others. And so I hope that through today's course of discussion and hopefully great questions from you all, we'll get a sense of how we shouldn't be building railroads like they did in the first industrial revolution. We shouldn't be building systems in our own walled gardens. And to the extent that we are in those places today, we ought to take lessons from things like the global goals, where there's 17 goals and 169 targets and 230 indicators, which we can begin to organize our work around, which sort of takes us to common data models. Over the 4 years that I've been one of the many contributors to the common data model for nonprofits, or the nonprofit common data model, call it whichever way you like, there have been many stakeholders that have been participating in adding their ideas, adding their experience. They come from technology companies like Threshold, where I work, to Flux, where Anthony is, and many of you on the phone may have contributed your own ideas and insights. Government funders, private funders, operating nonprofits, large and small, the world over, and subject matter experts that operate in the independent space. But one of the things that's come up a lot during all of this discussion is, well, what is a common data model, and who has a common data model? And so on the slide here, I've put out what we see as the definition of a common data model, which is that it's a shared data language for business and analytical applications to use. And it includes a standardized and extensible set of tables, fields, metadata, and relationships. And those are the 4 key ingredients of a common data model. Equally important, common data models are not apps, right? They are not solutions. They are not FLUXX's solutions. They are not Threshold solutions. They are not Microsoft solutions. They are not Salesforce's solutions. They are not Smart Simple solutions, and the list goes on and on. They are not applications. A common data model is a design, right? It just exists as an idea and a collection of these standardized, extensible tables, fields, metadata, and relationships. And so if you hear someone say, well, our app is the common data model, they're not thinking about it in the right context. The intended output of a common data model is that data and its meaning can be shared. And our ultimate outcome that's sought by sharing this data language is that we can save time and expense that can be reallocated to higher value tasks, and the interoperability and sustainable of investments and technical solutions can be improved. So if we take that as the basis for what a common data model is, and we apply that in the context of the nonprofit common data model, the nonprofit common data model is a shared data language for nonprofit business and analytical applications and the humans that use them to use. The nonprofit common data model in its current version, which is 3.03, and we'll talk about where you can find it later, includes in its core about 75 tables, about 1,500 fields, and all of the associated metadata and relationships that are part of that. So the 4 key ingredients are included in it. And you might hear people refer to that as the core common data model for nonprofits, or the core nonprofit common data model, because there is actually an add-on, an optional add-on for IOTI reporting for those of you that might find that interesting. And within that singular core, which is that design, you have a variety of different models, which you can think of as kind of windows into the same house, right? So if the core common data model is one design, there are a bunch of sort of sub-designs that are more modular that we might think about in the context of the work that we do. And you don't have to use the whole thing, right? So there's a core model for program design. There's a core model for project management. There's a core model for omni-channel fundraising, core model for awards. And through a variety of other collaborations and later versions, there's a core model for things like managing the logistics and movement of goods and services in a humanitarian context, for doing assessments, which originally came from doing disaster assessments, but actually was sort of genericized to do any type of assessment, which actually could be used for doing, you know, grantee assessments or programmatic assessments and so forth. So each of these modules is sort of a collection of components of that core nonprofit common data model that you can pick and choose from to meet the specific purpose that you have. Or if you have Flux for grant management, but you have a different solution for fundraising, you could use the common data model as that shared data language to map between the core tables, fields, metadata, and relationships in Flux to that fundraising solution. And that can help improve that interoperability. So this is a deliberately small picture of the common data model for nonprofits on the left, because today's goal isn't to drag you through all of those fields, tables, metadata, and relationships. We can save that for another session, and then both in the chat inside of Pathable, as well as in the links that you'll see in the attached presentation at the end, you'll be able to get access to all of that content. And feel free to reach out to me or Anthony or the nonprofit common data model community if you have any questions or you'd like a walkthrough. So now that we've got a good understanding of what a common data model is as a design and what the nonprofit common data model is as an application of that design, what we want to do is kind of get back to the core topic of like, where did this thing come from, right? And where might it be going? And then talk a little bit about our core discussion around, well, how might we be able to leverage this idea and this design to try to improve capacity? So the nonprofit common data model actually came from the sector itself, right? The first major milestone that you can kind of put on a timeline is around 2017. There were a group of people that were really mostly living in and around the humanitarian response world, in organizations that were delivering on humanitarian response, others that were providing gift in kind and providing services in that context. And they sort of realized, you know, when we're in these like hazard conditions, right, whether it's, you know, dealing with refugee crises or resettlement crises or, you know, sudden onset, you know, natural disasters, we need a better way to understand how each of us operate so that we can, in those theaters, be more efficient about delivering humanitarian aid. Pretty easy to get your head around why people would come together around that construct. And they ultimately created something called the NGO reference model, which essentially was a common way of thinking about the operations of NGOs in those theaters and the way that they did certain things. Like, how did they raise money? How did they bring together goods and services? How did they warehouse those services? How did they move those goods and services around in preparation for their predictions around what might happen and where they might be needed from a support perspective? And the list kind of goes on and on and on. And so they published this thing called the NGO reference model, and then began to adapt and use that as a common language for their operations, so that when they were either preparing for or responding to these kinds of situations, they could be more efficient in understanding what each other were actually talking about. And that worked really well for them. And then with time, they started to realize, it's good that we have a better understanding, maybe not a perfect understanding, but a better understanding of our operating models. What if we could share data in that context? What if I am doing a disaster assessment after some kind of hazard occurs, and then you come along a little bit later and do the same assessment, and then somebody else comes along and does the same assessment? And on average, they found through studies that somewhere between 5 and 7 assessments of the same situation under the same context were being done in the vast majority of these types of theaters. And so they said, we need to contribute to this idea of being able to have a common language around sharing data. They said, look, no platform provider is going to cover everything. So this isn't about making like one technology company be the provider. In fact, as we're more of a platform world and more of an interoperable world, we should let competitive and market forces continue to play themselves out. But we do want to try to make it easier for implementers and for the technology organizations that are supplying these types of services to be able to connect their things together better. We want them to do that work. So let's come together and contribute to the idea of a common data model for nonprofits so that people can then, of their own volition and on a voluntary basis, pick that up, apply it to their solutions if they're technology providers, or if you're an organization, you just want to build your own, you can use it as a design reference to try to accelerate the build effort itself and the sustenance effort as more investment goes into it. So in November of 2018, version 1 was released at the NetHope Summit in Dublin. The effort was funded and stewarded by Microsoft, but it was published as an open source solution, which it remains as today. And then over the course of really about 3 years or so, about six additional versions were published to get us up to the current version of 3.03 today, which includes that 75 tables, 1,500 fields, and all the associated metadata and relationships for those models that we saw on the prior slides. The model itself is going to continue to evolve to the extent that the ecosystem determines it should. And as you can see, starting in 2021, a lot of different providers started to map to it, to build upon it, and then also to make recommendations to extend it so that ultimately they could deliver better interoperability and more sustainable technology investments around the context of a shared data language in the nonprofit environment. So that kind of gets us to the current day today. And there's a subset of the aligned logos that are up on the screen that is not an exhaustive list by any measure. In total, there's, at least the last count that I'm aware of, maybe about 150 technology companies that have either built solutions on top of, aligned solutions to, or built connectors or at least high-level maps based on the common data model that they make available to their customers, to their partners, and so on and so forth. So, really great progress in the course of just a few years to see a lot of people come together, and take this to heart and try to contribute to it, but also leverage it for the betterment of society and for the goal of trying to improve capacity within the environment as well. So what I was hoping to do next was, to sort of talk about how we as an organization have begun to leverage this kind of design and implement it in a solution that's out and available in the market today, just as one of the many showcase examples that are there, ultimately with the goal of trying to improve capacity. And so I'm going to flip over to b.world, which is an application that runs in the cloud. It's built on Microsoft Azure, that's created by our company, threshold.world, with the product vision of mobilizing the global impact community's capacity for change by unifying program design, impact measurement, and storytelling in one application that's kind of sign up and go. So we're going to take a look at a use case within that today to try to get a sense of how could you, just like we, take something like the common data model and get solutions to market more quickly because you don't have to go do that core design work around data models. So here's the site for b.world, which has all of the general marketing content. The platform allows for free trials. Anybody can log in and sign up for a trial at any point that they want, scale that up to your user base and so forth. And so when a b.world team, which is kind of our core construct, a team of people that are coming together to bring about a social or environmental change, or at least attempt to create a team within b.world, they're brought into an environment where they're going to be able to see their activities, or as we call them, their projects. So the projects in b.world are mapped directly to one of the core constructs of the nonprofit common data model, which is called the delivery framework. Right? So the crux of programmatic design and delivery in the common data model is this thing called the delivery framework, which is linked at the highest level end to the theories of change, and at the lowest level end all the way to program participants, which can be entities, people, or things like forests or beaches or artwork or whatever the case might be. But the application surfaces that design around activities as something called projects. And so as a b.world team, when you enter the application, you see all of the projects that you have visibility to from your team, as well as any projects from other teams that have been shared with you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So to take a look at an example project, I have one open here called the Collaborative Impact Grants. So the use case here is that there's an organization that's providing funding to try to help organizations that they make awards to improve their capacity for delivery, whatever their mission might be. So the b.world team creates that project, again, aligned to the CDM, and they come in here and they're able to kind of define what that project is. They can manage a status, and they can answer questions like when, where, why, and with who here in the project overview. All of these map directly into design components in the CDM. So b.world is surfacing those components, and when we were designing this, we didn't have to really think a whole lot about this. And one of the key things that we didn't really have to spend a lot of time about was thinking about how do causes and implementers that are focused on environmental circumstances, how do they model the things that they engage with? So we came up with this idea and labeled it as things, where if you're doing a collaborative impact grant with somebody who's trying to reintroduce the crested toad in an environment, or doing beach cleanups, an organization can come just create those things right here in the application. And we were able to leverage that kind of constituent model that was part of the common data model for nonprofits to pull this off. The next thing that the application allows you to do is kind of define an overall theory of change or results framework, both of which are designs inside of the common data model for nonprofits. So we labeled that whiteboards because we noticed a lot of people that are engaged in defining or implementing or tracking programs used visual tools to design those programs, whether they were in the process of seeking funding or tracking kind of adaptive implementations. They were doing that in things like PowerPoint or more online tools like Miro and Lucidchart. And so we decided to create a visual whiteboard that would allow people to drag components of a results framework like impact level goals, objectives, activities, and indicators onto a page, kind of an infinite canvas, connect them all up, record narrative insights along the side of that, and then in a single button click, be able to generate a log frame directly from that program design without having to actually translate from PowerPoint to Excel. So again, we leveraged the log frame construct that was within the common data model to put a skin on top of this feature to allow people to actually have a structured model along with a visual model that they could use for communication tools. And then within that log frame construct, you of course need to be able to design things like indicators. And so we leverage the measurement constructs within the common data model to create the indicator capabilities within the b.world application. So things like the reporting frequency, the data types, the units of measurement, the models for dimensions and disaggregates, all of these were design concepts that we were able to pull forward into the application to try to make it really easy for people to create indicators. And just to show you a quick view of that, you could either pick from a library and project elements, you can create custom indicators, or the common data model has a direct mapping to the UN Statistics Division's API for the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can actually come in and leverage that and select indicators directly from the SDG library within the app as well. So we wanted to provide all of those different contexts. And then as an organization is implementing, we leverage that measurement construct to try to be able to prefab data tables that are really easy to come in and enter results into, like this one, as well as be able to provide a user just a single click to generate all of the charts and analytics that they might want to see within their program delivery. So things like the baseline and target values are core designs. The ability to stack or separate dimensions and disaggregates are similar concepts from the CDM as well. And so that measurement and kind of impact measurement or output measurement capability is embedded, as well as kind of, skinning that with interactive charts and so forth. The CDM also has a concept around project management and program management. So we incorporated things like the ability to upload documents, the ability to manage tasks within an activity framework, and of course, the ability to sort of fund and track expenditures around programmatic activities as well. So all three of those concepts came, really from those core models inside of the CDM, but were built into the program construct here. And then the one thing that we added that was really different from what the CDM offered, but was really a lesson learned by being a contributor, was that if you're going to do all that work, right, and you're going to be doing this either in b.world or whatever tool you choose, it should be really easy for you to share that with other people, whether you're providing updates to funders and stakeholders, or whether you're trying to build a knowledge base for your team because your team is evolving all the time, or because you want to track and record the history in an easy to understand way. We came up with this idea kind of spurred by the ideas of our early user base that stories are probably the best way for humans to learn. And there's a pretty well understood model for what makes a great story, which is including things like evidence, narrative, and visuals. So our thought was, well, how could we take all of this content and make it easy to include that in a story that included evidence, narrative, and visuals? And so b.world allows people to create different types of stories. And just in the interest of time, we'll show you one that's already kind of been pre-created for this collaborative impact grant project, where the user is asked essentially 6 questions based on the type of story, and can add backgrounds and logos. They can pull in maps from the project. You can embed videos from YouTube, and you can respond to or skip any of the questions that it asks. But you can also very easily do things like go and pull from the charts that you already have in the application. Like maybe you're providing just a quarterly update. So I'm just going to select from January, February, and March, and I want to insert that chart, and then maybe pull in some narrative about some of the things that we learned during the course of the project and drop that right into one of the fields. And then that gives you the ability to preview and publish that story to the sources that you might want to update with, and get a shareable link, or you can go straight to the social networks. So it ultimately would tie back into the construct of program reporting, leveraging the idea of storytelling as a way, an effective means of communicating programmatic outputs. And then all of those stories across your programmatic activities create this knowledge base of searchable, reportable stories that you can pull from to try to share that knowledge forward. But you also don't lose kind of the evidence construct that's built around the common data models measurement framework, where you can build aggregate results, like saying, well, we want to look at all of the teachers that we trained across all of our initiatives, and you want to pull those specific indicators together in a singular context. So b.world as an app is one of many examples of how we were able to really learn from all of the inputs that were in that open source nonprofit common data model, and leverage those different contexts to try to bring a solution to market with the goal of kind of, mobilizing impact capacity and making it so that project teams across organizations could share their programmatic efforts and the learning through storytelling that comes along with it. We've provided a few slides that just kind of show some of those highlights as a leave behind. But I did want to swing back around to the core construct that we started with in the beginning, which was the CDM. And so on this page, we've provided a number of references of places that you can dig deeper into the nonprofit common data model. And all of these, again, are published both inside of Pathable, inside of the chat, but there are also links inside the presentation that's linked into the session agenda itself. One of the best references is the CDM entity relationship diagrams, which actually will give you the visual models for all of those different core CDM components that we saw on the slide about fundraising, about award management, about case management, about humanitarian logistics, and so forth. You can download that file. There's also a zip file that includes all of the images that come along with it. And there are source files that you can download and import to Visio if that's a tool that you prefer to use as well. Another reference that's great is that you can pull down from this GitHub site, the core, what's called the core metadata reference, which includes an Excel file with every single table and each of its fields and all their metadata and relationships that you can then use as a mapping guide, right? If you want to use it as that common data language to kind of map between systems. There are a couple of links here where you can actually drive through Microsoft's app if you want to see more detail there. And of course, you can join the CDM community. And then the bottom link here is a link to a bunch of videos that have been published about the CDM. So I hope this has been a good kind of whirlwind tour around how this asset that's been created by the sector for the sector can hopefully accelerate your ability to increase capacity either in your own organization or with the partners that you choose to work with, or for the technology providers to be able to accelerate the designs that you bring to market in service of the market overall. So very happy to see if there's any questions, comments, or considerations, and very grateful to be here today.
So just a reminder, folks, if you have any questions, please leave them in the Pathable chat. Be glad to, Dan would be glad to get to those. Some common questions that come up here, Dan, so I'm interested, how do I get started? There are so many resources. Where do you recommend going first?
Yeah, I think if you're more interested in sort of like, well, what do the tables look like in the structure? Let's say you're an application builder or maybe kind of an admin hero, so to speak. I think the CDM entity relationship document and the core metadata reference are your best sources, because those are the things that will actually give you kind of the detail behind the scenes. You'll get a visual view through the entity relationship diagrams, and you'll get the detail of like, okay, well, I want to take a look at the awards table so I can use that as a way to map things into Flux, right? And then I want to take a look at how Flux organizes this, and I want to see how, my data collection appliance might be able to connect to that for program level reporting. If you're more the kind of person that is, sort of a visual learner or an auditory learner, I think that these videos that we've published around the CDM will walk you through the different modules and kind of give you a snapshot of each of those resources. And I think those are great places to start. And then, of course, if you want to like jump into one or multiple apps to like just bang on a system for a little bit and see how these things come to life, b.world trial is a free and easy way to do that with no obligation. And you can also go to Microsoft's App Source and look at the nonprofit accelerator and do a test drive of that. And then you can actually click all the way through the entire model in Microsoft's sort of front end. Again, you don't have to buy anything to do that. You can just kind of go from app, from follow a donation, from fundraising into awards that go out to a program, all the way down to an educational program. And there's a demo guide that'll give you a walkthrough of all of that. So depending on how you learn and what you're interested in, those are the best places to go.
Very cool. One question I've got for you. So you mentioned that there are about 150 vendors and tools that are CDM compliant in some way, shape, or form, right? Do you have a few prominent examples that come to mind, vendors or tools of particular interest that kind of go deep in CDM compatibility?
Yeah, there's different answers depending on kind of which category or part of the model we're talking about. If we go to fundraising for a minute, for example, there's an organization called PICNet that has a very successful application or suite of applications that have been in the market for a very long time for nonprofit fundraising, right? And they're built on their own infrastructure. They work generally with large to small organizations, and they've also worked in the Salesforce ecosystem for a very long time to connect to organizations that are using Salesforce for fundraising. And so as the CDM emerged, PicNet decided, well, we want to make sure that our applications, whether they're for event management or advocacy or for individual fundraising, can connect through the CDM to either Microsoft-based solutions or others. So PicNet was one that actually kind of took up that charge, contributed some of the core designs to that kind of processing, and then also created connected applications that are now available in the marketplace. So big fan of what they've done. Other organizations have done a lot of work, like HSO, RSM, and Avanade are three large consulting organizations that do work in Microsoft technologies and others, that their teams are well educated and versed on the CDM. Ours is another example of that, where we never build without the CDM in mind, right? Irrespective of which technology platform the customers that we're working with are using, or if we're working in an environment where an organization has, you know, an existing suite of applications, but is maybe looking for an analytics solution, and they have, you know, 4 or 5 different apps or platforms in play, and they have no intention of switching because they're very happy with the solutions that they've chosen. You can actually use a CDM in the analytics layer to kind of bring all that together and then put your reporting appliance, you know, on top of that. And that could be Tableau or Power BI or any other number of solutions like that. So I could go on for a long time. We're lucky to be pretty active in the partner community around it, but they're in every category, whether it's case management, grants management, fundraising, humanitarian logistics. There's different organizations that have kind of taken different levels of adoption. One thing I really want to be clear about too is that there's no standard or like seal of approval for like orgs that have adopted or are applying the CDM. It's totally voluntary, right? There isn't like a certification or like a, you know, you're a CDM certified kind of model. And that's really by design, right? This is intended to be a community-driven effort, one that's really grassroots, whether it's from technology providers or organizations that are doing the work themselves or with implementing partners. And so while there have been a lot of organizations that have recommended, hey, we ought to have an easy way for people to learn their way down this path, which is in place now with some of these links and others. There isn't like a, you know, these people are in the crew and others are not, which I think I really appreciate.
Very interesting. Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of our attendees. It was really great to learn more about the CDM, and I'm sure many folks here are eager to dig in further. I know I am. Just a reminder, if any folks have, you know, further questions, if you could go to this last slide here, Dan. Yep, our contact information is up here, so feel free to reach out. And just as a reminder, Dan did drop a ton of great resources into the chat, plus they're at the end of the deck, which is also available. So I strongly encourage anybody here who's interested in learning more to check out those resources. Yeah. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everybody. And Anthony, thanks again for having us. It's an honor to be here with all these incredible human beings. So enjoy the rest of FLUXXCON.
Absolutely. Talk soon.